The suburban kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and the promise of a quiet Sunday, exactly the kind of morning Theodore Kingsley used to buy with his Wall Street bonuses. But Alexandra didn't look at the expensive marble countertops. She stared at the DNA test results, trembling in her hands, proving the child he had viciously denied was entirely his. A ghost from a shattered marriage was about to knock on her door, bleeding both pride and a desperate need for the family he threw away. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet, devastating spaces between betrayal and redemption, stay with me. There are still many secrets left to unfold behind these closed doors. The neon sign of the Sunrise Diner flickered with a low, persistent hum, casting long, bruised shadows of pink and blue across the wet asphalt of the parking lot. Inside, the heavy scent of roasted coffee beans and fried potatoes hung in the air, a familiar greasy comfort that had become Alexandra Pemberton's entire world. She stood behind the worn Formica counter, a damp rag paused in her hand, staring blankly at the autumn rain sliding down the large plate glass window. Her uniform, a simple faded blue apron over a white blouse, was a far cry from the tailored silk and designer heels she had worn 5 years ago in a sprawling Manhattan penthouse. Back then, she had been Mrs. Theodore Kingsley, the envied wife of a ruthless financial prodigy. Now she was just Alex, the day shift manager, who knew exactly how much sugar the local mechanics took in their morning brew. Penny for them. A deep, gentle voice broke through the ambient clatter of silverware and quiet chatter. Alexandra blinked, pulling her gaze away from the dreary afternoon outside. Rob Patterson was leaning against the pastry case, wiping down a coffee mug with the quiet, steady rhythm that defined everything about him. There was flour dusted on his forearms, and a small, knowing smile played on his lips. He was the anchor she had found when the storm of her past had nearly drowned her, the man who had helped her assemble a crib in a cramped one-bedroom apartment without ever asking for a piece of her broken heart in return. Just thinking about the inventory, Alexandra lied smoothly, offering a tired but genuine smile. "We're running low on the hazelnut syrup again." Rob didn't press her. He never did. He just nodded, setting the mug down. "I'll add it to the supplier list for Tuesday." Alexandra turned back to the window, the damp rag resuming its mechanical circles on the counter. She had built a fortress here in this quiet upstate town. It was a safe, unremarkable life for herself and her 5-year-old son, Leo. A boy who possessed Theodore's piercing green eyes, but thankfully none of his cruelty. She had spent half a decade bearing the memory of the night Theodore had thrown a fabricated DNA test onto their marble kitchen island. She could still see his eyes, cold and devoid of any history they shared, as he accused her of sleeping with a junior analyst, all to neatly justify his own torrid, highly publicized affair with Harper Wilson. She had survived the scandal. She had survived the sudden, terrifying poverty. She thought she had finally outrun the ghost of Theodore Kingsley. But as a sleek, midnight black Mercedes-Benz S-Class glided into the diner's pothole-riddled parking lot, Alexandra's heart seized. It was an alien object in this blue-collar landscape of rusted pickup trucks and sensible sedans. The engine cut off. The driver's side door remained shut, but the rear passenger door opened slowly. A man stepped out into the biting drizzle. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, the kind that cost more than Alexandra made in 6 months. But it hung loosely on his frame as if draped over a wire hanger. Alexandra's breath hitched in her throat. The damp rag slipped from her numb fingers, landing with a soft, wet slap on the linoleum floor. It was Theodore. He looked older. The arrogant sharpness of his jawline had been replaced by a hollowed-out exhaustion. The silver at his temples wasn't distinguished anymore. It just looked tired, almost sickly. He stood in the rain for a long moment, staring up at the glowing neon sign of the Sunrise Diner, before his gaze drifted down and locked onto Alexandra through the rain-streaked glass. Even from across the parking lot, she could see a raw, naked desperation in those familiar green eyes. The man who had ruthlessly erased her from his life was standing at her door, and deep down in the cold pit of her stomach, Alexandra knew he hadn't come all this way just to apologize. He had come because he needed something. The little brass bell above the diner door jingled a sharp, cheerful sound that felt like the tolling of an executioner's bell. The sharp jingle of the brass bell echoed through the nearly empty diner, but to Alexandra it sounded like shattering glass. Theodore Kingsley stood just inside the threshold, bringing with him the sharp ozone scent of the autumn storm and the faint, lingering trace of Tom Ford cologne, a ghost from a life she had meticulously buried. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Sunrise Diner were unforgiving. They exposed the hollowed-out contours of his cheeks and the yellowish pallor of his skin, a stark contrast to the aggressive sun-kissed vitality he had possessed 5 years ago. His charcoal overcoat, clearly bespoke, hung off his shoulders, as if tailored for a man a size larger. He didn't move immediately. His green eyes, usually so commanding and full of a sharp calculation, scanned the cracked vinyl booths, the rotating pie case, and finally landed on her. The raw vulnerability in his gaze was terrifying. It was wrong. Theodore Kingsley never looked vulnerable. He orchestrated vulnerability in others. Behind the counter, Alexandra felt her fingernails bite into her palms. The damp rag lay forgotten at her feet. She couldn't breathe. The safety of the greasy air, the comforting hum of the refrigerators, it all vanished, replaced by the suffocating chill of their Manhattan penthouse the night he had thrown the forged paternity test in her face. Sensing the sudden absolute freeze in her posture, Rob stepped forward from the pastry case. He didn't rush, but his broad shoulders squared, placing himself subtly between Alexandra and the door. "Can I help you, buddy?" Rob asked, his voice an even, unyielding baritone. Theodore blinked as if just noticing Rob's existence. A flicker of his old patrician annoyance crossed his features, but died instantly, swallowed by exhaustion. "I need to speak to my wife." Theodore said, his voice a gravelly rasp that sounded nothing like the smooth baritone that used to close multi-million-dollar acquisitions. "Ex-wife," Alexandra corrected automatically. The words tore from her throat, sharp and defensive. She stepped out from behind Rob's protective shadow, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "We have nothing to say to each other, Theodore. Get out." Theodore took a slow, painful step toward the counter. His hands, trembling, slightly came up in a placating gesture. "Alex, please. I didn't come here to fight. I don't have the strength for it." "Well, then you shouldn't have made the drive." She shot back, her voice remarkably steady, despite the chaotic terror swirling inside her. "Go back to the city. Go back to Harper." At the mention of his new wife's name, Theodore let out a harsh, bitter sound that was half laugh, half cough. He leaned heavily against the edge of a booth, gripping the faux leather backrest until his knuckles turned white. "Harper is gone, Alex. She filed for divorce the day after the first biopsy came back. It turns out, in sickness and in health, wasn't a clause she was willing to honor." Alexandra stared at him. The vindication she should have felt, the petty human desire to see her betrayer betrayed, was entirely absent. There was only a cold, creeping dread. Biopsy. "I'm dying, Alex," Theodore said softly, the confession dropping into the quiet diner like a lead weight. "Acute myeloid leukemia. The chemo isn't working fast enough. I need a bone marrow transplant, and my registry matches fell through." And the silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain against the plate glass window. Rob looked at Alexandra, his expression tight with concern, but he remained silent, giving her the space to process the bomb that had just been dropped. Alexandra swallowed hard, forcing the words through the tight constriction in her throat. "I'm sorry to hear that, Theodore. Truly. But I don't see what that has to do with me. We share no blood." Theodore's gaze shifted. It drifted from her pale face past the coffee machines and settled on a small corkboard near the kitchen swing doors. Pinned to the center was a child's drawing in vibrant, messy crayon, a bright yellow sun over a crooked diner signed Leo age 5 in clumsy block letters. When Theodore looked back at her, the desperation in his eyes had hardened into a terrifying, singular focus. The man who had publicly destroyed her reputation to deny his own flesh and blood was now staring at her with the panicked greed of a drowning man. "Not you," Theodore whispered, his voice cracking, "but the boy. Where is my son, Alex?" The rhythmic, unbalanced thump of the cheap washing machine in the hallway was usually a comforting sound to Alexandra, a mundane reminder of the quiet, ordinary life she had built. Tonight it sounded like a countdown. She stood in the doorway of the tiny second bedroom, bathed in the faint amber glow of a star-shaped nightlight. Leo was sprawled across his twin bed, one leg kicked free of the superhero comforter, his breathing deep and even. In sleep, the soft, boyish curves of his face gave way to the underlying bone structure. The sharp, aristocratic line of his jaw that belonged entirely to the man who had stood in the diner hours ago begging for his life. Alexandra crossed her arms over her chest, digging her fingertips into her own flesh until it ached, trying to ground herself in the physical present. Theodore's words kept echoing in the cramped, humid air of the apartment. Acute myeloid leukemia. The boy. Where is my son? For 5 years, she had been the sole architect of Leo's reality. In that reality, his father was a vague, abstract concept, an absence smoothly paved over by Alexandra's fierce devotion and the steady paternal warmth of Rob Patterson. Now Theodore was demanding a wrecking ball be taken to that foundation. She turned away from the sleeping child and walked quietly down the narrow hallway into the kitchen. Rob was sitting at the small laminate dining table. He had closed up the diner alone, letting her leave early the moment Theodore had finally shakily walked out the glass doors. Now Rob sat in the dim light of the stove hood, 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea resting on the scratched surface before him. He didn't look out of place in her tiny kitchen. His large frame seemed to absorb the anxiety in the room rather than add to it. Alexandra pulled out a vinyl-backed chair and sank into it. The exhaustion hit her all at once, a physical weight that made her bones feel hollow. "He's asleep," she murmured, wrapping her cold hands around the hot ceramic mug. "You should be too," Rob said softly. His dark eyes were perceptive, watching the microscopic tremors in her fingers. He didn't ask her what she was going to do. He didn't offer platitudes about doing the right thing. "How do I choose Rob?" Her voice broke a fragile, desperate sound in the quiet room. "If I say no, I am issuing a death sentence. And one day Leo will grow up and realize I let his biological father die without even trying to see if he was a match." She looked down at the pale surface of her tea, seeing the ghosts of her Manhattan life swirling in the steam. "But if I say yes, if I let him near Leo, Theodore is toxic. He's a black hole. He destroyed me to protect his reputation and his mistress. He looked at a piece of paper he knew was fake and called me a whore in front of his lawyers. How do I subject a 5-year-old boy into a man who is capable of that?" Rob reached across the small table. His hand rough with calluses from years of working grills and carrying crates covered hers. It was warm, solid, and completely devoid of demands. "You're assuming he still has that kind of power over you," Rob said quietly. "He doesn't, Alex. You aren't that scared girl in the penthouse anymore. You built this." He gestured slightly to the modest walls of the apartment. "You kept Leo safe. Theodore is just a sick, desperate man who has run out of options." Alexandra squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the steady rhythm of his pulse against her palm. He was right about her strength, but he didn't understand the insidious nature of Theodore Kingsley's world. Theodore didn't just want marrow, he wanted absolution, and he was willing to bleed her dry again to get it. Before she could respond, her cell phone vibrated violently against the laminate table. The screen lit up, piercing the dim kitchen. It was an unknown Manhattan number. The digital glare felt like a spotlight, invasive and blinding. The quiet after the storm was officially over. The unknown Manhattan number had rung 3 times before dropping to voicemail. Alexandra hadn't answered it, but the digital ghost of it lingered over her all night, a heavy premonition that followed her into the next day's shift at the Sunrise Diner. By 2 in the afternoon, the lunch rush had ebbed into a quiet lull. The rain from the previous day had given way to a flat, gray overcast. Alexandra was wiping down the chrome rims of the pie display when the brass bell above the door jingled. The sound of sharp, distinct footsteps clicking against the cracked linoleum made her freeze. It was the sound of a $3,000 pair of Christian Louboutins, a sound that unequivocally did not belong in this zip code. Alexandra turned slowly. Standing in the center of the diner, looking as if she had just stepped out of a private car service, which she undoubtedly had, was Harper Wilson. She was as strikingly beautiful as she had been in the paparazzi photos 5 years ago, but the perfection was brittle. Her blonde hair was a flawless, icy shield, and her camel cashmere coat was belted tightly around her thin waist. Harper didn't look at the faded booths or the scuffed floor. Her pale blue eyes locked immediately onto Alexandra, analyzing her faded uniform and tired posture with a momentary flicker of triumph before settling into cold calculation. "Hello, Alexandra," Harper said. Her voice was smooth-cultured and devoid of any genuine warmth. Rob emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, his gaze immediately narrowing at the newcomer. Alexandra held up a hand, a silent signal for him to stay back. She untied her apron, tossing it onto the counter, and walked around to meet the woman who had helped destroy her life. "Harper," Alexandra replied, her voice remarkably level, "I'm surprised you know how to navigate outside the Upper East Side." Harper ignored the barb. She slid into the nearest booth, the faux leather sighing under her weight, and gestured to the empty seat across from her. Sit down. We have business to discuss, and I would rather not do it standing in a place that smells like old grease. Reluctantly, Alexandra sat. We have no business. Theodore was here yesterday. If he sent you... Theodore doesn't know I'm here. Harper interrupted, a sharp edge cutting through her polished tone. In fact, Theodore barely knows what day it is. The chemotherapy has turned his brain to mush. Alexandra stared at her, repulsed by the casual cruelty. He said you filed for divorce. I did, Harper confirmed, tracing the rim of the sugar dispenser with a manicured nail. But the timing of his illness is incredibly inconvenient. If Theodore dies before the settlement is finalized and signed by a judge, the Kingsley Family Trust absorbs everything. The prenuptial agreement has a mortality clause. I get a pittance. I lose the townhouse. I lose the Hamptons property. The ugly, naked truth of it settled on the table. Theodore had thrown away his own flesh and blood for a woman who was now calculating his expiration date in dollars and cents. Harper reached into her designer handbag and withdrew a sleek, embossed envelope. She slid it across the scratched Formica table. It stopped inches from Alexandra's hands. I know he asked you for the bond, Harper said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And I know why you'd say no. He ruined you. But think practically, Alexandra. Look around you. She waved a dismissive hand at the diner. You are serving coffee to truck drivers. That envelope contains a certified cashier's check for $2 million. It's a fraction of what I stand to lose, but it's more than you'll make in a lifetime here. Alexandra looked down at the heavy, expensive paper. The sheer audacity of it made her lungs burn. You want to buy my son's bone marrow, Alexandra stated, the words tasting like ash. I am compensating you for your time and the child's discomfort, Harper corrected smoothly. Theodore gets his transplant, he lives long enough to sign the papers, and I get what I am owed. You get a college fund and a house that isn't falling apart. Everyone wins. Alexandra didn't touch the envelope. Instead, she looked up, meeting Harper's icy gaze with a blazing, quiet fury. He left me with nothing, Alexandra said softly. He took my dignity, my home, and he tried to take my sanity by telling the world my baby was a bastard. And he did it for you. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. Take your money, Harper. Get out of my diner. If Theodore dies, he dies knowing the woman he destroyed his family for only cared about his bank accounts. And you can live with the fact that you backed the wrong horse. Harper's flawless mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine ugly panic. She snatched the envelope off the table, her knuckles white. You're a fool, she hissed, standing up so fast the table wobbled. You're going to let a grudge keep you poor, and you're going to let the father of your child die. He ceased being a father the day he forged that DNA test, Alexandra said, standing to meet her. Now get out before I have Rob throw you out into the rain. Harper's departure left a toxic residue in the diner's air, a lingering scent of expensive perfume and cheap morality. Alexandra stood by the booth for a long time, her hands trembling so violently she had to press them flat against the Formica table to steady herself. Rob watched her from the kitchen, past silent and solid a lighthouse in the sudden fog of her past. 2 days passed in a tense, suspended reality. Alexandra waited for the other shoe to drop, for a squad of corporate lawyers to descend, or for Theodore to return with renewed venom. What came instead was a frantic, weak pounding on the diner's glass doors an hour after closing on a Friday night. Alexandra and Rob were wiping down the counters. Outside, the parking lot was submerged in the bleak yellow wash of the street lamps. Through the rain-streaked glass, a figure was slumped against the doorframe, a pale hand smearing a bloody handprint against the pane. Rob was moving before Alexandra could process the image. He unlocked the deadbolt and hauled the door open. Theodore Kingsley practically fell inside, collapsing onto the wet linoleum. He was unrecognizable from the man who had stood there earlier in the week. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, and a thin stream of dark blood leaked from his nose, staining his pale lips and his rumpled shirt collar. His skin was translucent, stretched too tight over his skull, burning with a feverish heat that radiated into the cool air of the diner. Call 911, Rob ordered tersely, already dropping to his knees to check Theodore's pulse. Alexandra stood frozen. She stared down at the man bleeding on her floor. 5 years ago, this man had stood in a bespoke suit flanked by two attorneys and handed her a falsified piece of paper that declared her a cheat and her unborn child a stranger. He had looked at her tears with utter indifference. Now he was a broken, pathetic shell dying at her feet. The universe had delivered its brutal justice, yet there was no satisfaction in it. Only a sickening heavy dread. She reached for the phone behind the register, her fingers dialing the numbers with mechanical precision. As she spoke to the dispatcher, Theodore's eyelids fluttered open. His gaze, glassy and unfocused, drifted until it found her face. "Alex!" He wheezed, the sound barely audible over the hum of the refrigerators. His bloody hand twitched, reaching out an inch toward her shoe before his strength gave out entirely. He lost consciousness. The ambulance arrived with a cacophony of sirens that shattered the quiet upstate night. Paramedics swarmed the diner, their sharp clinical voices cutting through the shock. As they loaded Theodore onto the stretcher, an EMT looked at Alexandra, taking in her pale face and her proximity to the fallen man. "Are you family?" the medic asked urgently. "His pressure is tanking. We need to know if he has any matches on file, anything. The hospital notes in his wallet say he's end-stage AML. Alexandra looked at Rob. His dark eyes offered no judgment, only a steady anchor as she teetered on the precipice of a decision that would alter their lives forever. She looked back at the stretcher, at the blood on the floor that shared half of its coating with the boy sleeping safely in her apartment. "I'm not his wife," Alexandra said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper. "But my son might be a match. I consent to the preliminary blood work, just the swab and the draw." Saying the words aloud felt like swallowing glass. She was officially inviting the monster back in. She was agreeing to a DNA test, the exact weapon Theodore had used to butcher her reputation and erase her child, this time to save his life. The fluorescent hum of the intensive care unit was a predatory sound, stripping away the comfort of the shadows. Alexandra sat in a stiff plastic chair in the hallway, her hands folded in her lap, watching the rhythmic flash of the red staff-only light. Beside her, Rob held a paper cup of lukewarm cafeteria coffee he hadn't touched in an hour. He didn't speak, he simply anchored her to the floor with his presence. Inside the room, Theodore was a mountain of pale flesh and tangled plastic tubing. He was awake now, propped up by pillows, his eyes fixed on the door with an intensity that bordered on manic. The lead hematologist, a woman whose exhaustion was etched into the deep lines around her mouth, stepped out of the room and approached Alexandra. She held a clipboard with a single sheet of paper, the results of the expedited HLA typing and the definitive paternity confirmation required by the hospital's legal board before proceeding with a minor donor. "It's a perfect match," the doctor said, her voice dropping to a respectful hush. "Not just a paternal match, but a 10 out of 10 HLA string. It's rare even for biological parents. If we move quickly, the transplant has a very high success rate." Alexandra felt the air leave her lungs. The truth, now codified in black ink and medical jargon, felt like a physical blow. It was the final absolute vindication of the woman she had been 5 years ago, and the final absolute condemnation of the man in that bed. "He wants to see you," the doctor added softly. "Both of you." Alexandra stood, her legs feeling like lead. She walked into the room alone, leaving Rob in the hallway. The smell of antiseptic and sickness was overwhelming. Theodore turned his head slowly. The arrogance that had once defined his every movement was gone, replaced by a raw, bleeding shame that made it difficult to look at him. "The doctor told me," Theodore whispered. His voice was a dry rattle. He reached out a hand, trembling toward the printout Alexandra held. 10 out of 10. He's mine. He was always mine." "Don't," Alexandra said, her voice cold and sharp as a scalpel. "Don't you dare claim him now because he's your cure. You didn't want a son, Theodore. You wanted a clean exit. You wanted Harper's father's connections and a life without the burden of a wife who saw through your bullshit." Theodore flinched as if she had struck him. Tears, thick and slow, tracked through the stubble on his sunken cheeks. "I was a coward, Alex. I let the ambition swallow me. I let Harper convince me that the timeline didn't add up. I wanted to believe the lie because the truth meant I had to be a better man than I was. You used a forged test to throw a pregnant woman onto the street," she reminded him, stepping closer to the bed until she could see the burst capillaries in his eyes. "You didn't just walk away. You tried to erase our existence. And now you're breathing because that same mistake is the only thing on this earth that can save you. Theodore let out a broken, jagged sob. He covered his face with his hands, the hospital ID bracelet rattling against his wrist. I don't deserve it. I know I don't. You're right. You don't. Alexandra agreed, her heart hardening in a way she didn't know was possible. But Leo is 5 years old. He has your eyes and your stubbornness, but he has a heart that hasn't been corrupted by Wall Street or vanity. I'm not doing this for you, Theodore. I'm doing this because I won't let my son grow up to be a man who could have saved a life and chose spite instead. I won't let you turn him into you. She turned to leave her hand on the heavy door. Alex, he called out, his voice small and desperate. She didn't turn around. I'll give it all back, he wheezed. The money, the trust, the penthouse. I'll sign everything over to him. Just let me see him, once. Alexandra tightened her grip on the handle. The offer of the life she had lost, the wealth, the security felt like an insult. You still think everything is a transaction, Theodore. That's why you're dying alone in a room that smells like bleach. She walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, leaving the man who had once owned her world weeping into the sterile silence of his own making. The pre-operative waiting room was a vacuum of sterile white light and the rhythmic muffled paging of doctors over the intercom. Alexandra sat on the edge of the vinyl chair, her coat still clutched in her lap, as if she were ready to bolt at any second. Through the small observation window of the pediatric wing, she could see Leo. He looked impossibly small in the oversized hospital gown, his attention captured by a tablet Rob was holding for him. Rob's presence was a silent grounding force. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply stayed, his hand resting on the back of Alexandra's chair, a physical barrier between her and the ghost of the man down the hall. He's brave, Alex, Rob whispered, his voice catching the quiet tension of the room. He thinks he's just helping a sick friend of yours. He doesn't have to know the rest, not today. But I know, Alexandra replied, her voice barely audible. I know that in an hour they are going to take a piece of my son to fix the man who tried to pretend he didn't exist. It feels like a second robbery, Rob. Like he's taking from us one last time. A nurse approached, nodding solemnly. We're ready for the donor harvest. Ms. Pemberton. The walk to the surgical suite felt like a funeral procession. Alexandra held Leo's hand until the very last moment, kissing his forehead and whispering promises of ice cream and long afternoons at the park. When the double doors swung shut, she didn't cry. The grief had hardened into a cold, crystalline resolve. Instead of returning to the waiting room, she walked toward the oncology intensive care unit. Theodore was prepped for the transfusion, his frail body dwarfed by the complexity of the machine surrounding him. When he saw her, a flicker of something resembling hope, or perhaps just the primal instinct to survive, ignited in his sunken eyes. Is he okay? Theodore asked. He is being a better man than you ever were, Alexandra said, standing at the foot of his bed. She didn't sit. She wanted the height, the distance, the undeniable proof that she was no longer the woman who had begged for his belief. Theodore reached for a stack of legal documents resting on his bedside table. My lawyers. They drafted the amendments this morning. I've set up a blind trust for Leo. $20 million to start. The deed to the Greenwich estate is being transferred to your name. I want to make it right, Alex. I want to be a father. I want to spend whatever time I have left making him realize who he is. Alexandra looked at the papers, the very things that would have felt like a miracle 5 years ago. Now they look like scrap paper. You think this makes it right? She asked, her voice dangerously calm. You think you can buy a seat at his birthday parties? You think $20 million erases the nights I spent crying in a studio apartment, wondering how I was going to buy diapers, because you froze our joint accounts? I was wrong, he choked out the monitor beside him, chirping as his heart rate climbed. I'll spend every penny, every breath, proving it. No, Theodore, you won't, she said, leaning in. You will get this transplant. You will live, and you will use that life to stay as far away from us as humanly possible. You don't get to play hero. You don't get to be daddy. To Leo, you are a stranger who was sick. To me, you are the lesson I finally learned. Alex, please, don't do this. I'm his father. Biologically, yes. The lab proved that, she said, her gaze unwavering. But a father is the man sitting in the waiting room right now. The man who has spent the last 4 years wiping Leo's scraped knees and reading him bedtime stories while you were busy being Harper Wilson's trophy husband. You signed away your rights the day you handed me that forged DNA test. I'm just here to make sure you remember that when the anesthesia wears off. She turned her back on him, then ignoring his desperate whispered pleas. As she walked out of the ICU, she saw the medical team wheeling the cooler containing the marrow toward Theodore's room. It was the ultimate irony. The very essence of the life he denied was the only thing that could keep his heart beating. Alexandra walked back to the pediatric wing, her pace quickening. She didn't want the gold, the estates, or the Kingsley name. She wanted the smell of the Sunrise Diner, the sound of the upstate rain, and the quiet, honest love of the people who didn't need a DNA test to know who they were to each other. 6 weeks later, the upstate air had turned brittle with the first true hint of winter. Inside the Sunrise Diner, the steam from the dishwasher created a hazy sanctuary against the frost-covered windows. Alexandra stood at the end of the counter sorting through a stack of mail that had arrived that morning. Near the bottom of the pile was a thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with the seal of a prestigious Manhattan law firm. She didn't need to open it to know what was inside. It would be the final confirmation of the trust fund, the deed to the Greenwich estate, and perhaps a handwritten plea for a visitation schedule. Theodore had survived. The transplant had been a success, a biological miracle facilitated by a 5-year-old boy who still believed he had simply helped a stranger. Theodore was currently in a high-end recovery suite in Connecticut, surrounded by the best nurses money could buy. But according to the brief clinical updates Alexandra allowed from his lawyers, he was a man who spoke to no one. "You're staring at it again," Rob said, sliding a plate of fresh cinnamon rolls onto the counter. He didn't look at the envelope with jealousy or suspicion. He looked at it as one looks at a heavy stone someone else is forced to carry. Alexandra looked up. Rob's face was familiar, lined with the honest exhaustion of a man who worked for everything he had. "He sent the final papers. Everything he promised. The life I thought I wanted when I was 24. And?" Rob asked quietly. Alexandra picked up the envelope. She thought about the Greenwich estate, the manicured lawns, the cold marble hallways, and the crushing weight of the Kingsley name. She thought about the way the neighbors would look at her, the scandalous ex-wife who came crawling back for the inheritance. Then she looked at the diner. She looked at the scuffed floor where she had stood her ground, the booth where she had faced down Harper, and the kitchen where Rob had taught her how to survive. The money stays in a restricted trust for Leo until he's 25. Alexandra said, her voice firm. "He can decide then if he wants that world. But the house, the titles, I'm declining them. I don't want to live in a museum of my own trauma." She took a pen from her apron pocket and scrawled "Return to sender" across the expensive stationery. It felt better than any scream or slap ever could. It was the sound of a door finally clicking shut. The brass bell jingled and Leo burst through the door, his cheeks flushed red from the cold, his school backpack bouncing against his small frame. He ran straight to Rob, who caught him in a practice lift, swinging him onto a bar stool. "Mom! Rob, I drew a star today," Leo shouted, rummaging through his bag to produce a crumpled paper. Alexandra watched them, the man who had chosen to be a father, and the boy who was growing up untainted by the shadow of his biological origins. Theodore Kingsley had his life back, but he would live it in a hollow kingdom, a king of nothing watching from a distance as the family he discarded thrived in the warmth of a life he wasn't brave enough to lead. She walked over to the window and flipped the sign from open to closed. For the first time in 5 years, the silence of the room didn't feel like an absence. It felt like a foundation. The past had come knocking, demanding a debt be paid in blood and marrow. Alexandra had paid it. But as she watched Rob ruffle Leo's hair, she knew the most important lesson of all: you can save a man's life without letting him back into yours. Some betrayals are so absolute that even a miracle can only buy a long, quiet goodbye. Alexandra took Leo's hand and walked toward the back of the diner, leaving the heavy envelope on the counter, a ghost of a life she no longer recognized, waiting to be swept away with the evening's dust.